what I'm going to do is go through 14 different things that I wish I had known when I started Irish family history. Some of them are slightly facetious. Uh, the first two I have included, they're not things that I basically got wrong, but they're ones that other people have told me they got wrong. So that's why I've included them first. So the other 12 are really things that I probably didn't know at the beginning. But I'll excuse myself from the first two because I think I did know them. But anyhow, we'll get started and you can let me know what you think at the end. I'm hoping to have a discussion about this. I don't think it's really the type of talk that you're going to have questions on, but it might promote discussion and we can have a little discussion at the end then. Okay, so I'll get started with point number one. And the first one is it's the importance of having an online tree. I was lucky in that I did start with an online tree, but I know a lot of people do start with just having a computer-based tree or maybe even just a paper-based tree. And one of the advantages of an online tree is that you're getting hints or you're finding a way of contacting others that are descended from the same people. And you can see just around the screen there a number of various sites that do provide an online tree. And there's many more that I haven't included on those. There's other ones there like Brothers Keeper and Family Tree Maker. They aren't online. They are pieces of software that you can buy in order to build your tree, but you can upload your tree then to a site on the internet that will help you. And one of the reasons that I think that's very important is that it ensures that your tree will survive. And I do know people, even within our society, who have totally lost their entire tree because their computer has irretrievably broken down and they cannot retrieve their family tree maker or whatever. And it means then that everything they have put into that program has gone. The other thing is what happens if we die? It's not maybe our computers who die, it's maybe us. And what happens? Is our family going to come along? Are they going to come along and just get all these different boxes of all this paperwork and computer disks and whatever else they can find in the house that have been lying there for years, and maybe they'll just stick it on the skip or in the bin? And what happens then? All your work's been for nothing. So at least if you have some of your information on an online tree, it means that that information will still be there to be used in the future. And it's a way of preserving your tree that I think is quite important. I would always recommend that somebody chooses one tree as their main tree. I use Genes Reunited. I know it's not a very popular site now. I think some people do, well, they did start trees there. They maybe don't use it as their main tree now. I have always used that as my main tree. I'm very used to it. I can update my tree a wee bit faster on that site. And then what I do is I would periodically upload that to other sites as and when I feel I want to. And it allows me then to create a GEDCOM file. And this GEDCOM file is the manner in which you can upload from one of these sites to another. So again, I've also heard other people who maybe have 3 different trees, maybe one on Family Search, one on Ancestry, and maybe one on Family Tree Maker. And what they do is they will find out a new piece of information and they'll start to update one of them. And then they'll forget to update the other 2. And then the next time they go to update one, they might update one of the other trees. And then they end up with 3 slightly different trees. And that's why I'm saying, if you always get in a manner of just uploading and just updating one particular tree, it means that that's the tree with all of your up-to-date information. And then you can export that to the other sites. And then you can't make a mistake when you do that. So do consider having an online tree if you haven't got one at the moment. Okay, my next hint is don't copy other people's trees. Again, this is not something I probably ever did, but I know it's something that a lot of people, particularly beginners, will do. They will just look at ancestry trees or trees they find on other sites, And basically what they're doing is copying other people's mistakes. Now, when I was researching this presentation, I found this little tree at the left. And this is my grandparents. This is my parents. And probably one of these is me. Now, I'm an only child, and somebody has just given me a brother on one of these sites. That is totally inaccurate. I did look to see if this person could potentially be a DNA match, just in case they were building a shadow tree for that reason. But the person shared only 7 centimorgans with me. Now, that doesn't constitute two brothers. So I really don't know what we're playing at by adding that on. But even the fact that they duplicated my tree, I don't even really mind that. But when they start to add incorrect information, it means that other people could come behind them and say, oh, look at that couple there. They had 2 sons. So that's why it's not useful. You know, you can't see the names because apparently we are both living. But, you know, if there had been names there, again, that information could be just incorrectly added. And you will find, I think you find a particular amount of inaccurate trees, particularly on Ancestry, because people are building speculative trees and they're building trees maybe to use with through lines. And for that reason, there's a lot of, well, there's a lot of rubbish out there, really. That's the easiest way to put it. I did have a look at one tree yesterday that I thought was very interesting. I just thought it and put it onto the presentation. We found a set of parents in the 1700s who lived in Dunfermline in Scotland. And then apparently they both came to County Tyrone and they had a son there. Now, to me, that's slightly suspicious because both of them, according to this tree, died in Dunfermline. So why they would go from Scotland away over to County Tyrone and have a son, well, it could happen, I suppose. But, you know, you think you would have evidence for that? There was no evidence on this tree. Then we found that this son had a family. Well, apparently his first son was born in North Carolina and died in North Carolina. So obviously they must have went to North Carolina, abandoned this child. Then they come back to Tyrone and had another one. Then they went to Island McGee, which is in a different county in Northern Ireland. Now, to me, that doesn't look like a proper tree. It looks like a Scottish family, a Tyrone family, and an American family that have all been intermixed, and somebody has just decided this is all the same family, and it's really not. So if you were having a tree like that, I would say that is slightly unusual. And if that was to be the case, it should be backed up by information. So as others who come along will see that information and realize it's correct, and not like me just being very skeptical about it. Okay, so that's a little hint about not copying trees. And again, it's leading into this one here, that not everyone in the 1700s left a trace. Particularly if you're looking for a common name, it just means that, you know, if you find a record for John Smith, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily your John Smith. It could be, but you're really going to have to do more research. It's not sufficient just to find a record for somebody in Ireland. Again, if you look at the area that this person or this record has survived from, it might give you a hint if it could potentially be your ancestor. But it's very unusual for people to be moving right across Ireland in those days and then maybe moving back again. People tended to stay within a more local area in the 1700s. But obviously, those trees or those records could give you a hint. And that can be a basis for theory. And then you can use that theory and research it to see if you think it is correct. But it does stand that there is more chance of a record surviving for those who were more wealthy than the working class who maybe didn't leave a paper trail behind them. And then with so many records being destroyed, it means that some of the records of the poorer people may not have survived. So it means that not everyone is descended from royalty, not everyone is descended from the well-to-do, and not everyone is going to have their ancestors in the peerage. That's one of the websites that you can find these families on. I'm not saying that your particular family isn't descended from those, but do check it out, because there's no point in making a family tree if it's just all wrong. You really want it to be accurate, and that's the most important thing. Another thing that I've found is that cousins sometimes had the same name, and therefore you could confuse two cousins, particularly if they live close by and maybe in the same parish or townland. I have found many examples of this, and even sometimes with very rare names. In fact, one I was looking at a while ago, it was two Israel Abernethys. Now, there was only two Israel Abernethys in the whole of Ireland, and they both lived next door to each other in the same townland, and that's because they were cousins. So always watch out for that. Even if you see a rare name, always give it a little bit of a check and make sure that you're not confusing two people who are closely related to each other and therefore may have received a name from a common ancestor that they both shared. And again, another thing that you can confuse very easily is children born to a particular family. And many children were named after a deceased sibling. That seemed to be something that happened quite a lot in Ireland in the 1800s. It probably happened in other places as well, but it's just something to bear in mind. So just because you have a birth date, you have to consider, is this the birth date for a deceased child, or is it potentially your ancestor who may have been born after the death of their sibling? So it's just a few points to bear in mind. Okay, so the next one I want to mention is about spellings. And I've just put two little examples up here for you. You can see up here, James Reid, R-E-I-D. And down here, he is named as James Reid, R-E-A-D-E. Now, this is definitely the same couple, because you can see this is the marriage of James Reid to Margaret Ann McDowell. You can see down here that that is the parents of the child who was born in 1870. So it's definitely the same couple. What you might also see is that Margaret Ann is down as A-N-N, and here it's A-N-N-E. And there's also another difference as well that you might have spotted. They lived in Galley Hill, which was a townland outside of Antrim town. And down here, it is written as Gawley Hill. I've also seen it as Gallows Hill. So there's a number of different pronunciations and spellings of the same townland, but it doesn't mean it's a different place. And you can see, even though there's variations in those names, that is just something that happens. So you have to think outside the box, and you have to try to find these other names. Again, another one I was looking at recently was a McFetridge. And I did get a slightly unusual spelling variation of it, and it was McElfetrick instead of McFetridge. So those two did seem quite different. And again, if you're looking for a birth or a marriage or a death, and you're not looking under the right spelling, then you're not going to find it. And that's something that you have to bear in mind. There is a wide variation in the spellings of some names. So do try and consider that. Also, names may have just changed in the same set of records if there was a new minister or priest come in and took over. And maybe he just decided, because he kept the register, he was spelling names in a slightly different way from his predecessor. And as I've mentioned, their place names also do change on a number of occasions. So do look out for different spellings of townlands and even townlands sometimes. Okay, so the next little tip I have for you is that not all gravestones last forever. Some deteriorate, and it can be water damage, as in the example of this large table gravestone here that I've taken a photograph of, and it's very hard to read that now. But something that you may be able to get is a transcription of that headstone, because that gravestone may have been transcribed by an individual or by an organization at an earlier period when that was still readable. Also, graveyards that no longer exist may have been fully transcribed before they were removed. So those type of things is something that you have to consider. So it's not really just always sufficient to go and visit a graveyard and have a little walk around. I know we all enjoy doing that, but if you do that and you don't find what you're looking for, it's not the end of the story. One thing that I'm aware of from my previous career in newspapers is that there was such a thing in Ireland as a notice of reinterment. And I used to love these when I worked in the paper because it meant that I got my bonus at the end of the week. But now I don't like them so much because I now realise how much this has affected me as a family historian. And what they are is they are basically a notice that is put in by a church whenever they decide that they want to remove existing graves and gravestones in their graveyard. And they normally do that by a decision made within the church, and it's because there's pressure on them to provide burial space, and maybe they are landlocked, so they don't have any more space. So the only way they can facilitate people in the area to be buried there is by reusing old graves. And there is regulations surrounding this procedure. And what happens is they have to put a note in a major newspaper. They also have to put a note, I think, into a local paper. And they can then do a third type of advertising, which can be a sign at the graveyard, or it can be a sign in a shop window or in a town hall or whatever. But they do have to notify people both across Northern Ireland and locally. That is the requirement of this. And you're normally given 6 weeks to respond to this. If you don't respond and show an interest in a grave within 6 weeks, it means that they have the right then to go in and to remove all of the bodies, to reinter them, and to reuse that grave plot. And at that stage, they will also remove all of the headstones as well. So this happened an awful lot of times in the 1990s. I'm sure personally, I put in 20 or 30 or 40 of these. So this is for graveyards in Northern Ireland that were subject to one of these notices. So at the time, if you objected and you said, I'm still attending this grave, or I have an interest in this grave, you were allowed to keep it, but you did have to make yourself notice within that time period. So it's just something to bear in mind, that just because you visit a graveyard, there may be no record of it, and that could be the reason. If you don't find a headstone and you can't find an earlier transcription, you can also look at some church records, because there may be records of burial. Now that is different from records of headstones. It's records of who was actually buried in which grave. So they can be very useful. And also look at newspapers, because death notices in newspapers may give you a burial place and give you a hint and an idea of where they were buried, even if there is no headstone or if the graveyard has changed its use since. Okay, the next one is that newspaper death notices are genealogical gold. And this is just a couple of examples from my own family that I'm going to talk you through. The first one I'm going to show you here is these two at the bottom. And you might see that they're very similar. They were both put in on different days. This one in the middle was put in, I think, on a Friday. This one went into the same paper on a Saturday. Now, I don't know if you can notice any difference, but the difference is the actual burial place. Balmoral Cemetery. This one, it's the city cemetery. So they actually advertised the wrong graveyard. Now that confused me whenever I first got this. So it does make sense to look in more than one newspaper, just in case you get different information on it. Now, the reason I think this happened was because there was a family grave in Balmoral. And I'm wondering if they made inquiries in that and maybe it was full, or maybe for some reason it wasn't appropriate to bury in that particular place. So they then bought a new grave, and my great-great-great grandmother was buried in the city cemetery. and that's where she was actually buried then. So it just is interesting that there is that difference. Now, this one here is again the same death notice. This one here was in the newsletter. This one here was in the Belfast Telegraph. They are virtually the same, but the interesting thing is that there's an additional name. You can see there's one name on this one, and there's two names on the one at the bottom. And that is giving me additional clues for children of the deceased. And that was a considerable help to me because, again, I hadn't heard of E. Majuri. And E. Majuri was actually Ellen Majuri. And it was Ellen Phillips who married Andrew Majuri and moved to Belfast. So it was very interesting to get that piece of information. So again, if I just looked in one newspaper, I wouldn't have found that. Okay, now we're just moving up to the top of the screen, and I'll just show you this one here that was in a newspaper in 1904. And what a lot of people say is that, yeah, my ancestors didn't have money, they wouldn't have put in death notices. But I can assure you that ordinary people, ordinary working class people that maybe didn't have very much to spare, did put in death notices on a regular basis. And the reason was that they put them in because it was informing people of a funeral and where the funeral was to take place. They couldn't phone each other. They didn't have phones. They didn't have mobiles. So what did they do? They would have put a notice into a newspaper. Now, in those days, there was 6 editions of the Belfast Telegraph. So you didn't have to put it into all of the editions. If you were poor, you may have just put it into one. And it may be that that particular death notice no longer survives because the edition put on the British Newspaper Archive is not the one that the actual death notice for your family member was in. But also there is a different copy of these papers in Belfast Central Library, and sometimes they can be accessed. And that does mean that you can sometimes get additional information from those actual hard copy editions. But I found this one here in 1904. Now, I knew that this lady called Eliza Close was my 3 times great grandmother. Because she died in 1904, I was able to find her on the 1901 census. So I knew that that was her name. I knew that her daughter and her son-in-law lived in 49 Mountjoy Street. But what I didn't know was where Eliza came from. And it says here that she was the widow of the late John Close of Muttonburn in Ballycarry. Now, that was my first clue that they actually came from Ballycarry. And Muttonburn isn't even a townland. It's a very small clachan of houses. It's just a few houses in a lane. So it's a very specific location. So that enabled me to realised that I had ancestors from Ballycarry when I started to do my research. I also had a clue in that they came from a specific part of Ballycarry that is in itself a very small village. So Muttonburn was a clue. When I looked at the church records, I was able to find a family called Close that were living in Muttonburn. And that was mentioned in the Ballycarry records. But if it wasn't for this particular death notice, I wouldn't have known to look there. The other piece of information there is that she was buried in the family burying ground. So that means that it wasn't just a new grave. It means that she was being buried with other family members. So I took myself off in the car and I went to Ballycarry. And whenever I got to the graveyard and I looked around for the first time after finding this death notice, I had deja vu, and I realized that I had been there with my father when I was a very young child, and he had been trying to find a grave and had got increasingly frustrated that he couldn't find it and would just left again. But I could not remember that at all until I went back and stood there, and it just came back to me. So I remembered I had been there. So that was, again, information that was important to me to remember because my father obviously knew that he had ancestors buried there. And this is the line that the Close family is actually on. But the other information that you can get here too is that American and Australian papers, please copy. And that was standard wording used at the time. And it meant that people had family in America and Australia. And they were basically saying, please put them into local papers over there because we want our relatives to be aware of the death of Eliza Close. That's what it was doing. So again, that is a hint that there is people in this family who have emigrated. I have subsequently found the Australian connection. I have still not found the American connection. So I'm hoping someday I will find that, but at least I know there is an American connection to this particular line of my family. And over here, you can see the death of Eliza, who was the person who put in the death notice for her mother in 1904, and she died in 1926. And what you can see here is, again, she's mentioning now that the McConnells came from Ballycarry. So this is Eliza Close, whose daughter married James McConnell. And now we know that James McConnell also came from Ballycarry and that his wife is then buried there. And then we're getting some additional information. We're finding that there was a niece and nephew, and we're finding that this Eliza Jane, and we're finding out her husband's name. So this is her married name. And we're finding out that she had a sister, Letitia. So this is a sister of Eliza McConnell. So Eliza McConnell was born Eliza Close, and then she had a sister, Letitia Close. And again, we have this wording, Australian papers, please copy. So if you don't spend the time looking at newspapers and looking for little pieces of genealogical gold, then you're not going to have these pointers back to where these people lived before they moved to Belfast or to a town or to the place that you know that they lived in. So just do bear that in mind. It's definitely worth exploring further with death notices in newspapers. My next tip is that not everyone in the grave is on the headstone. And this is a mistake that I made with this particular family. And this is my grandfather's grave. I knew that my grandfather was Thomas Walker, and I knew he died in 1966, so I never met him. And I knew that he was buried in the city cemetery, and that's the grave number. Now, when I did my research, I started to research his family, and I identified that his parents were William Walker and Isabella Norris, Norris. But I subsequently started to research the Norris family. And when I did that, I came across a potential brother for Isabella. And I was looking at this family, and it was a Robert Norris. And I thought this could be her brother, but I couldn't prove it. And I did everything I could to prove it without any success. So I was researching all the members of this family. I still thought it was right, but I didn't have any evidence. And then I looked up the inhabitants of this particular grave. And guess what? Thomas was buried with Robert, who was his uncle, and Jane, who was his wife, and also James Alexander, who was Thomas's cousin. So that means that Thomas was buried with his aunt and uncle and their child. So therefore, if I have only had clicked on the grave number, I would have been able to see that probably 18 months before. And it would have given me the proof instead of giving me sleepless nights trying to connect this family to mine when the evidence was there all along. And it is very interesting that Thomas was buried with a family that he probably didn't know very well. He wasn't born until 1893, so he would never have met his aunt. And he's buried in the grave with her. And then his uncle Robert would have died when he was about 8. And then his cousin would have died when he was about 20. So again, he probably didn't know these people very well, but for some reason, when he died, he was buried in their grave. I'm assuming at the time there wasn't a headstone whatsoever. So therefore, his children put up a headstone for him. Now, when I found this out, Thomas's son was still alive. And I spoke to him about his father's grave. And I said, you know, who's buried there? And he says, oh, nobody, that was a new grave. So even within the family, they didn't forget to put on the names of the Norrises. They really did not know that they were already buried there. So obviously somebody knew because they produced these grave papers, but that person has since died. And the people who put up the headstone were Thomas's children, and they didn't know there was any other inhabitants in this particular grave. So it's just something to bear in mind, that grave numbers can be very important, and they can help you to find other people, because there will normally be a connection between the people in a grave, and that can help you to maybe find the married name of a sister or a cousin or something. So if you find other occupants of that grave, do definitely look to see if you can establish a family connection, because 99 times out of 100, you're going to find one if you look hard enough. Okay, so the other thing is that witnesses at weddings and those who registered births and deaths are often relatives. It's not always apparent, because sometimes the surnames are totally different and you may not even realize, and it may not be listed that they're relatives. Now, this is one for, this is the birth of my great grandmother, who was Elizabeth McVeigh, and her parents are noted here as William John McVeigh and Margaret Black. So if I found a birth, then I would be looking to see who registered that birth. In this instance, it was Eliza Jane Black. So I'm now thinking that is the same surname as the mother. But quite often it could be a totally different surname. And maybe it's Margaret's married sister who is registering the birth for her. And again, the surname would not be the same. So even if you get a different surname, do check it out and see if you can establish a family connection. In this case, Eliza Jane was actually Margaret's mother, so that was her married name, and she had been born Eliza Jane Nesbitt. And I knew that Eliza Jane Nesbitt had married Alexander Black, and they lived in 113 Crimea Street. So that was one that was familiar to me, but it could have potentially helped me to break through a brick wall and get a generation further back. And that was because Margaret Black was born in 1852. So she was born before the advent of birth certificates. And that means that when I get any information on her, I could get her marriage, but her marriage would only give me her father's name. It wouldn't have given me her mother's name. So this could have potentially been a bit of a breakthrough moment, in that I now have a name of somebody who could potentially be her mother. So if you think of it along those lines, these little pieces of information can be very, very useful. And they're also very easily overlooked. Now, this is another real example where I did something slightly unusual. And I had a bit of a brick wall with my ancestor, who was called Agnes Craig. And she was born around 1830. And I didn't have any brothers and sisters for her. And I knew there had to be brothers and sisters out there. Well, I presumed there was, and I just couldn't find them. And I knew that Agnes Craig had married my ancestor Samuel McDowell. So what I decided to do, because I had tried everything and got nowhere, I decided to go through all of the marriages for anyone who had John Craig as a father. The reason I did that was because Agnes Craig's father was John. And I decided to look for other people who had John as a father, just to see if there was any way that I could link them to my Agnes through either a place or through a family name. And if you look at the very bottom of this, you will see that the witnesses' names are Samuel McDowell and Agnes McDowell. And that was Mary Jane's sister and her brother-in-law. So this gave me a clue that this was Mary Jane's, this gave me a clue that this was a sister for Agnes. I didn't have any other identifying information. I didn't even know that the father was normally recorded as a gardener, because on Agnes's he was recorded as a labourer. So I thought, this is probably a sister. It couldn't be a cousin, because both of their fathers then couldn't have the same name. So I thought, this has to be two sisters. So therefore, I wanted to put this to the test, and I built out the family of William Watkins and Mary Jane Craig, and I found they only had one child before Mary Jane died. And when they had that child went on to marry, and there was a family. And when I looked down that family, I found DNA matches to that particular family. But because the surname wasn't Craig, I hadn't identified these before. So I did have matches to the Watkins family. And again, it comes down to a female. So the surname changes again. But it gave me a link back to the Craig family and back to my Agnes Craig. So again, I was able to do that because I used a site called Roots Ireland, and it allows you to search under the name of the father. And that is a very useful thing to do. You're not going to get any new records there that you can't get on Irish genealogy, but what you will do is get a facility to search under a father's Christian name. And that, I find, can be very useful when you're running out of options to extend your family tree. So that's another little hint to bear in mind. Okay, another one, again, a real example where I made a mistake and gave myself an awful lot of work I didn't need to, was that lodgers are often relatives. When you look at the census, you won't always realize that people are related to each other because it's not noted. Here in this family, you'll see John Crothers is the head of the household. His wife is Eliza Jane Crothers, but she was actually born Eliza Jane Manili. So again, you don't get any surname match to the family. But Florence Armstrong was actually Eliza Jane's first cousin, and they're related on the maternal side, and that's why the surnames are different. Florence is widowed at 23, and it meant that she had originally been a McConnell, and Eliza Jane had originally been a Manili, but both of their grandparents were close, the family I mentioned earlier, and that is the connection between them. So Eliza McConnell is actually Florence's mother. And what was happening here was that Florence had just been widowed by her husband, who had died of TB, and Florence was to die within a couple of years. And her mother was actually looking after her in the household. Florence had already had to part with her two children because of her illness, and it meant that she had to give them to a family on a temporary basis before her family was able to take these two children back. So that's what was going on here. They were noted as boarders, but they were actually relatives. And it's quite poignant to note that Eliza Jane, within a few years, was left as the only person left in this family. Her husband, John, went off to World War I and drowned when his ship was attacked. Florence died of TB, and then Eliza died a number of years later. So Eliza Jane was left out of that one household. She had already lost her only child, and she then went on to remarry and live to a ripe old age, but she lived it without her family around her. So again, you can start to put a story around some of these events, but definitely do look to see if you can find a connection between boarders and the other people in the household, because you may just find their cousins or some other type of relative. Okay, another little clue, and again, I wish someone had told me this when I first started off, that illegitimate children often used the maternal grandfather's name on their marriage certificate. And it all makes perfect sense if you think it out. Because normally, if you're illegitimate, it meant that in the 1800s, you would have lived with your mother. Your mother wouldn't have been able to afford to move out of the house, so she was probably still living in her parental home. and it means that the head of the household would have been her father. So therefore, this child would have grown up with the head of the household being his maternal grandfather. And that was the nearest thing to a father figure that he had. And therefore, it could well be that he would give that name whenever he was asked to identify a father at his own wedding. So this is something that happened here. And you can see at the top that Albert Brown was born on the 18th of November 1870 in Mullacarton. Again, this is a name that is spelled many different ways. It's M-U-L-L-I, but it could be M-U-L-L-A, or it could be M-A-G-H-E-R-A. It could be Macra-Carton. So there's all different spellings of this. And it means then that Albert was born. You can see there's no father's name given. But when he married in 1906, he didn't even get his age quite right, because you would have thought he was born in 1876. In fact, he was born in 1870. So he was actually around 36 when he married. So again, errors here, but you just have to identify that it's the same family. And I can very clearly identify that this is the same family, because he lived in Macragall, and also you can see that the name of the witness, Edward Brown, is actually his cousin. And this is his cousin's wife. So what you're seeing here is that his father was down as James Brown. Now, James Brown was actually his mother's father, and James Brown was a weaver. So it was very easily proved for me that this is what had happened in that particular occasion. And I've subsequently found a number of examples of the same type of thing. So if I had found this marriage and just been aimlessly looking for a birth for an Albert Brown with James as a father, I was never going to find that. So if that's what's happened to you, do think outside the box a bit. Think, could Albert have been illegitimate? And think, could you potentially find a different birth record that could help you get through your brick wall and solve this equation for you? Okay, moving on now, but it's a similar subject. We're looking now at originals and copies of birth, marriages, and deaths. And there can indeed be different information. You can see in this little example here that it says here, see new certified copy, because there was an error in this. And you can see the error is that Robert Fulton was the father, but then it says over here, Robert Wilson was the father. This is the person who registered the birth. But the reason they've made this mistake is because Wilson is the surname of the mother. So this was incorrectly recorded, and then it was subsequently corrected. But sometimes these mistakes were not spotted. So there can be differences. So if you go to the General Registry Office of Northern Ireland onto their site and purchase a copy of a certificate, then you will get the original. Now you can do this online, and if it's an older record, you will be able to view them for £2.50, and you will see the original record. Anything that's on Irish genealogy.ie is probably the same, but there could on occasion be differences because that was a handwritten copy. And what you might also find is that Groney records were not complete. And that means that some people didn't get registered when they died. And I have an ancestor who there is no record of his death ever being registered, but I have found his death date because there was a death notice put into the newspaper for him. So that has given me the date, but they have done a check at Groney and his death was never registered. I've also found some children who also were not registered when they were born. And I found mistakes in marriages. And again, the Groney marriages were collected in. And what happened was sometimes churches didn't give Groney their set of records. And if they didn't give them to them, they never became part of the civil register. And Groney have actually noticed this recently, and they're still actively trying to pursue some records which they didn't get back in the 1800s that should have legally been passed on to them. So if you find something that doesn't quite add up on a Groney marriage certificate, I would actually look at the original church marriage, because you may find that something has just been copied incorrectly. And sometimes I have found an example where maybe a father's Christian name was different, and the church record would probably be the correct one, because that's the one that was filled out at the time of the marriage. So again, just remember, copies and originals are all slightly different, and they're normally the same, but there can be differences. And if you've got a query in your family tree and you think something isn't correct, you might be, well, it might be a good idea to actually then look at the other versions to see if you can find something that will help you solve this dilemma. So that's something else to bear in mind. We're just getting near the end now, and there are always stories to be found. So I've just put up two little examples here, and this is one that I found recently. I know you won't be able to see this, but this is an old sixpence from 1881. It's not coming out well because that's what it looked like in the newspaper when it was copied. And there's a little article here that says the 1881 sixpence pictured here has a mistake, says its owner, Mr. S. McDowell of 266 Old Lodge Road, Belfast. Now, that was my grandfather, and I didn't know, because this was in the newspaper in 1971 in the Ireland Saturday Night, and I don't ever remember that newspaper being purchased in our house. And if it was, I would have been 3, and I wouldn't have really been aware of all of this anyhow. But there's some information in it that I didn't know. And it says that he discovered the coin amongst this day's takings in his grocery shop 7 years ago, and he's kept the coin ever since. So he must have found this then about, I suppose, about 1964. And it said when he examined it, there was a spelling mistake in it, and he thinks it was a slip of the designer's pen. It then gives his age, and it gives a little piece of information about my grandfather that I had no idea about. It said that he was the oldest surviving member of the 20th Belfast Boys Scout Troop. Now, that's not connected to the fact he had a grocery shop or that he found a coin, so I'm not even sure why they put this in. But they said he was at its 50th anniversary celebrations some years ago in the Presbyterian hostel. So I did not know that my grandfather was a Boy Scout, and I certainly didn't know he was at an anniversary celebration or that he was the oldest surviving member of that particular scout troop. So all of this information can be found in newspapers if you do searches. I did not find that under my grandfather's name, because you can see there his name was isn't even mentioned. It's just it's just his initial. So I did a search for his address, and that was the address of his shop. And when I did the address for his shop, this little gem popped up for me. I then decided to look in British Newspaper Archive for my own name to see if there was any record of my previous life. And I found an article that I wrote in 1995 for the Sunday Life. I remember having written this because I interviewed Anne Charleston out of an Australian TV show called Neighbours that some of you will have heard of. And I interviewed her at the Grand Opera House in Belfast. And I did this little article, but I haven't seen it probably from 1995. And it's just very interesting to be able to find that again. Now, I didn't even really remember the details of the interview I did with her. I wasn't researching my family tree at this time, but I know it's too small for you to read. But actually, when you look at this bit down here, it does actually say in a quote that I got from her that all of her 8 great-grandparents were born in Ireland. And at the time, she had bought a cottage in County Cork, and she was spending a lot of her year there. And that's why she was appearing in Belfast in pantomime at the time that I spoke to her. So it's, again, that's giving information to me about my life because I'd forgotten about that particular article. And also it's given me information on her history that might be interesting now to follow up, that I've got into the family history game that I wasn't really in 1985 whenever I did that article. So just one more tip, and I'm sure any of you here who know me don't expect me to end a presentation without mentioning DNA. So my little tip on DNA is that Y-DNA can reveal information that you can't get any other way. Because Y-DNA, for those of you who don't know, is something that males inherit from their patrilineal line. So it comes from the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, and back into the mists of time. And Y-DNA has had an awful lot of advances in the last few years. So just in case you don't know, Y-DNA can now give you very accurate timescales and generational definition. So what it's doing is putting your matches into a specific order depending on whether they have a mutation or not. And those mutations are lineage defining. So it means that if you have a list of 10 people and you have tested up to the big Y level, then it is possible for you to get information on which one of those is closest to you in terms of generations. And if you get enough people tested, you will basically have something that resembles a family tree, but instead of having names, it will have mutations. So it will show you exactly how you're related to everybody and specific timescales for when they think your common ancestor lived. But there's also fun to it as well. And you can find your connections to notable people and ancient connections. And I've got an example of each of them here. This one here, now it's not me actually, but this is just one on the FTDNA website. And this is somebody who had a connection to Albert Einstein. And it's predicting that they shared an ancestor back in 1250 AD. So that is interesting to be able to get that information if this was you. And again, you can also find links to ancient connections as well. So this is a body that was found and the DNA processed, and they have estimated that this person lived between 993 AD and 1149 AD. And the particular person who has this link, it says only 16 people in the FTDNA database are this closely related to this particular body that was found. And they think that they shared an ancestor about 650 AD. So even some of these ancient connections are actually, in the last couple of thousand years. So again, it's pointing out a rare connection for you. And that can be very useful to get that type of information because it's giving you more information on the migration patterns and where your actual line came from. And just as a little parting shot, I'll just explain that I had a Cameron ancestor that I was trying to trace. I got someone to take the test for me, and I was able to find a very specific location of where my Camerons had came from. They came from Loudon in Ayrshire. And I subsequently found that they weren't part of Clan Cameron, but they were part of another family that originally seemed to have taken on the surname Berry. And then some branches of the family continued to be called Berry, but for some reason, my line changed the name to Cameron. I don't know why that was. It maybe was some type of debt. It could have been maybe they were on the wrong side of a battle. It could have been illegitimacy. It could have been somebody being brought up by their mother's second husband. There's many, many different reasons why that could happen, but it's now given me something to explore, and I could now potentially get further back with that. So it's just interesting to get that information because there's no other way that I could get that information apart from a Y-DNA test.